this morning, will my intention is for this to be our last discussion of this particular topic. And beginning next week, we'll look at Romans chapter 12. So I'll give you the assignment up front, and that is to read the first 12 chapters of Romans between now and next week, and especially chapter 12. So we'll be going to the book of Romans. Actually, there's a correlation between what Jesus does, in my view, on the Sermon on the Mount, and especially in the Beatitudes, that connects very nicely with what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 12. And when we get to that point, we'll see if we can't make that connection. You know, by way of brief background, Jesus had begun his ministry. We saw that in Matthew chapter 4 and Matthew chapter 5. He was calling people together, or people came together. And from the context of the passage, he clearly was talking to his disciples, that is, those who he had called as apostles. He had done that and been recorded in Matthew chapter 4. But also there were lots of other people that were there because the crowd gathered there. And what we know from what we've studied so far is that in the Beatitude, Jesus highlights in summary form what it means to be a member of the kingdom community, because he talked a lot, especially in Matthew's writing, about the kingdom of heaven. He pointed out that both attitude and behaviors are to be exhibited by us as kingdom citizens, and that this is an inside out thing. It's what's inside of us that causes things on the outside of us. So that then he talked about the residents of the kingdom are poor in spirit. That is, they're not high-minded or putting themselves on a pedestal. Rather, they're acknowledging they're not worthy and that God is holy. They mourn. That is, they regret and are sorrowful for the sins in their lives. But they have a sense of control about who they are and control of their emotions, so they can focus on what God's will is and their position of support and service to others. They seek God's wisdom and guidance by being open to it and craving righteousness, because they recognize God's forgiveness has shown them that they need to exhibit mercy to others. Their motives are undiluted. They're not hypocritical in the kingdom. And their hearts and minds are focused on serving and glorifying God. And all of this leads them to want to share with others the experience of the joy and blessedness that they have. Therefore, they seek to be peacemakers as they interact with others. They want others to be reconciled to God and to with each other. But Jesus also adds that because of all these kind of characteristics and behaviors, not everybody is going to like them. And that, in fact, they will be persecuted. But even in persecution, that's a blessing if they're being persecuted for his name's sake. So with all of that, then Jesus comes to a point where, as John led us in last week, a discussion of two kinds of metaphors, or two ways to think about it. I can imagine that Jesus is saying, here's how you ought to be, here's how your attitude ought to be. And if you do that, then here are two things that you're going to be. One is you're going to be salt. And as John described for us last week, in summary fashion, salt does sort of three big things. One, salt's identified with purity. And that is that Christians are to uphold certain standards in the world. A Christian is like pure vanilla extract, not like artificial or diluted flavor. You know, when I go to the store, and my wife has instructed me that what you're looking for is pure vanilla extract. You're not looking for artificial flavor, because the pure vanilla extract brings a certain amount of flavor and a certain amount of strength and a certain amount of body to the meal and to the dessert that we're having, uh, that artificial flavor doesn't. So salt brings the idea of purity, but salt also serves as a preservative. It keeps things from going bad. It keeps things from being corrupted. In fact, Christians should be like salt, and salt, in a sense, is an antiseptic. You know, what antiseptics do is they both get rid of the bad and they create a presence or an environment where good things can exist. So, especially these days, we are all aware of hand washing, cleaning our counters and things with an antiseptic, because we want to get rid of the bad stuff, but we also want to have a surface that is good. The third and last thing that I'll mention, and John mentioned many more, but that salt adds and enhances flavor to things. Christianity is to add flavor to life. If it doesn't, then Jesus said that he warns his followers that if you don't do these kinds of things and your saltiness loses its savor, then the purpose or the function of the salt doesn't exist. It should be thrown out. Some of the reading that I've done, and you've likely done additional readings, says that this idea of salt being thrown out comes because one of the things that during this culture they did was they laid down a bed of salt, and on top of that salt they put tiles, and the tiles were then heated, and meals were prepared on top of that. But over a period of time, the salt no longer gave the insulating power that was needed, and they had to take up the towels and they threw the salt out. And so Jesus said, your salt is good for nothing but to be thrown out for people to walk on. Well, having said that, Jesus then turns to the next metaphor. And it's a familiar one for as we look through the scripture. He says in verses 14 and 15 of Matthew chapter 5, you're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid, nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. Now, again, light's a common metaphor that's used in the Bible. Light and dark. Paul especially talks about light and darkness, where light is contrasted to darkness, and that the world itself is often talked about as being dark. But light allows people to see. And Christians allow the world to, in our best moments, to understand how much God loves us and what Jesus has done to restore the relationship between all mankind, humankind, and God. In fact, what Jesus said about himself is that, especially in the Gospel of John, in John 1:9, that the true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world when John talked about Jesus. And then Jesus talked about himself. In John 8:12, he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Then in John 12:46, I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. And then in John 12:36, Put your trust in the light while you have it, so that you may become sons of light. So Jesus came to the earth so he could show God's love and help us to not be in darkness. So Paul said in 2 Corinthians 4:6, for God made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. But Jesus is preparing in the Beatitudes is really preparing the disciples. Now, he's at the front end of his ministry, if you will, but he knows there's going to be a back end. So he's preparing the disciples because there's going to be a time when he is gone. So what does he say? He already begins to tell them, you are the light of the world. Well, what does Jesus mean to them? Well, there are a few things, and you probably can think of a number more, and we'll talk about those, your thoughts on that in a few minutes. But here's one thing. When he says that, and he points out that a light is something to be seen. That is, if we think about the houses, and Patty mentioned that she's gone to the mount where the sermon was given, so she might have seen some of the houses around there that mimic some of the older houses during Jesus' time. They were small houses, and what they had for them was the only light came through a small window, and they also had a lamp. Now the lamp was, if you will, a candle or a flame in a salsa-like container, and it was set on the lampstand, and with that then it would light the whole house. Sometimes some scholars think that because the lamp was hard to relight, they didn't want it to blow out. So when they went out of the house, they put it under a bushel so the light wouldn't be blown out by wind gusts. So when Jesus uses the idea, he says, the light isn't meant to be put under a bushel. Well, that's true. It's not. The primary duty of the light is the lamp is so that it can be seen. Here's a statement that one person said: there can be no such thing as secret disciples, for either the secrecy destroys the discipleship, or the discipleship destroys the secrecy. So we as Christians are intended to be seen, and we'll talk some more about that in a moment. But we also have to be careful that Christianity should not be visible only within the church. In fact, if our Christianity stops at the door, that is our gathering or at our time together like these, then we aren't really serving our purpose fully. Now, let's be clear. Our purpose is to be Christians with each other. And in fact, it begins there. And when we look at Romans chapter 12 beginning next week, that will be even clearer for us. But it's to exist everywhere that we go. Jesus didn't say that we are the light of the church. He says we're the light of the world. And that a man's life and Christianity should be evident to all people. The second thing that a light does, or a second thing, is that a light is a guide. I think Richard Gilmore pointed out last week in reference to a light that when you turn on a light switch, you turn on the light switch so that the room is lit and so that you can see where you're going, that you don't run into things. In fact, a light is something to make clear the way. So part of the task of Christians is to make the way clear to others. Now, I think that it's not only clear to others in terms of coming to Christ, which it does, which we are to do, but also to make clear the way of how we're to live in with each other in this world that God has given us to have dominion over as humankind. So that when we see something going on that's not right, then as light, we're also to make comments about that. I can remember that I heard years ago that Christians ought to be separate from the world, therefore shouldn't engage in politics, shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that, because you become polluted by the world. Well, James addresses that, but keep in mind that what's really being talked about here is um, we have to, as Christians, remember salt again has purity. We have to have standards, have to talk about those standards, because if we don't, then who will? If we don't represent Christ, the world needs our guiding light. So a challenge for each of us is to ask ourselves, are we guiding those around us, and are we being guided in the light itself? A third thing that light does, a light often can be a warning light. A light tells us if there's danger ahead. You know, the reason we have headlights on our car is because when people were driving cars and they didn't have lights, it only meant you could drive in the daytime. And you took a great risk driving at night. One of the great inventions in the late 1800s and early 1900s was having the electric light, so we could light up things, we could see what was going on. Think of a traffic light. It has three colors: red, yellow, and green. Each has a purpose and a message of how to proceed safely. The red light tells us you shouldn't proceed at all. You need to stop. The yellow light tells us you need to be cautious about what's going on in this situation you're in. And then there's a green light that says, okay, you can proceed. So think of a traffic light when we think about the warning that a light is to give. Think about a railroad crossing signal. Unfortunately, there are accidents from time to time at railroad crossings because people will either not see, or the light's not working, or they will ignore the light. What that leads to, unfortunately, often is disaster. The third thing there, then, to consider is that it's our job to bring warnings for each other. None of us wants to be in the situation where we say, or someone says at the judgment or later in life, and I've had this happen, in fact, in a different context, where someone said to me, you know, if someone had told me that earlier, I wouldn't have done what I did. I wouldn't have made some of the mistakes. We might be able to think about that in our own lives, that if I had listened to the warning that was given me, or if I had seen the signs, if I had enough understanding, that is, I had enough light, I would have made a different choice. We never want to be in the situation where someone can say to us, why didn't you tell me? You didn't warn me. Now, we also need to be careful, because I've had this happen, maybe you have too, where someone says, well, why didn't you make me do it? Well, hold up. My job is not to make you do anything. My role is to share understanding with you, give you encouragement or warning, but my role is not to make you do anything. And sometimes we can have regret in life. In fact, I was with a caregiver for my wife yesterday. She came to render a service to her here at home, and she was talking about learning to play the piano as a child. And she said, you know, as an adult, I don't know how to play. My mom had me playing when I was younger, but I didn't like it, so I stopped. But I really wish she had made me continue. I'd really like to be able to do that now. Well, our job as Christians is to point things out, is to do warning, is to be guides, and to do that. So Jesus then says in verse 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. There are two big ideas here. Men are and people are to see our good deeds. Now, my understanding is that from the Greek, there are two words that are used for good. One has to do with good being a quality. You know, we say sometimes that, gee, that's a good piece of fabric, meaning it has a certain kind of quality to it, a certain kind of weight to it, versus being cheap or thin. It's of good quality. But there's another word that's used for good in the original language, and it's the one that's used here. And it means that not only is a thing of good quality, but also that it's captivating, that it's charming, it's beautiful, that it's attractive. So when Jesus says that men may see your good works, it's not only the quality of your works, but they must be attractive also. It's possible to do good things, but not to be attractive. In fact, it repels others. The Pharisees did that. They did the right thing for the wrong reason. Therefore, lots of people didn't like the Pharisees. It's not because and Jesus said, your righteousness should surpass that of the Pharisees, not because what they were doing was wrong, but the attitude that they have in doing it. So Paul, when he's writing about giving to the good work of helping to feed people in famine, he says, you need to be like the Macedonians. They gave even out of their poverty. They wanted to give. They were attractive because not only what they gave, but how they gave. So our attitude in giving should be one of cheerfulness. So our good deeds, Jesus says, should be given. The other thing about our good deeds, then, it is to draw attention. Now, again, let's be careful. It's not to draw attention to us. It's not so that we look good. What Jesus says is that people can see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So I've heard ministers say that when they deliver a message, and maybe JW or Paul or others who do that regularly, people will comment, hey, that was really a good message, et cetera, that sometimes they have to be careful that they don't get the big head and think this is about me. It's about the content of the message, not the messenger necessarily. So Paul says, and we'll see this again in Romans chapter 12, he starts off by saying, you got to live a transformed life. And you shouldn't think more of yourself than you ought to. Because if you do, then you're misrepresenting even the good that you do. Well, as a final thought before we have some discussion here, the question then becomes, if those things are the case, then how do we go about doing things in the world such that our good deeds are shown? Well, let me point out some things that an author, materials I was looking at in preparation pointed out that I thought I had some helpful things to consider. One is that sometimes believers want to be visible by only being together. You say, well, we as a group of Christians will just do this and people will notice us. So the first thing is isolation. Think about this. James does say in James 1:27 that we're to be careful to not be polluted by the world. So in an effort to be different than the world, we'll just stay by ourselves. So we listen to only Christian radio. We read only Christian newspapers. We buy music from only Christian artists. We have Christian television. We seek to watch Christian movies. And the more the world becomes an immoral place, the more we look for Christian alternatives. Now, not saying that those alternatives are necessarily wrong. In fact, they can be very useful and very helpful. But think about what that does also, what isolation does. Isolation keeps us from others and others from us. Then if that's the case, how are we salt and light to the world? In fact, Paul addressed that when he was looking at immorality. In 1 Corinthians 5:9-11, he says, I have written you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. But then he quickly adds in verse 10, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral. In that case, you would have to leave the world. But now I'm writing you that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother, but is immoral. Paul was a realist and recognized that if we're only associated with each other, then we don't have the influence that we want to have. The way you keep the church pure is you deal with what's going on in the church, not by avoiding people who are not in the church. All right. The second thing we can do, and sometimes we do, is that we try to be visible through proclamation. And by that, we mean using persuasive words. So we have things like Bible studies, gospel meetings. There are TV shows that are often very helpful. And we communicate from our safe place. And if we only communicate from our safe place, and we as a congregation certainly do have folk who attend our congregation who are not members of our congregation or members of any churches, so they hear the word. But if we only communicate from our safe place, then how do we get to the place where most of the people are that need the salt and need the light? Paul in 1 Corinthians 2:4 said, my message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power. Remember, one of the things that Paul chose to do, he was a tent maker. So when he went places, and he talked about this to the Philippians, that he didn't require money of them. And the reason that he didn't require money of them is because he chose to work, because he didn't want them to feel obligated to him or him to feel obligated to them. And it also gave him a chance to interact with people. In fact, many of the letters of Paul are called the prison epistles because he wrote to the churches, but he was in prison, and it was in prison that he was having influence and people were being converted. And the whole book of Philemon talks about that, how a person was converted and then sent back. So we have to be where the people are. We have to be so that we can be seen. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with crusades. There's nothing wrong with outlets like we have, uh, like the Zoom conferences, FaceTime, the radio programs, the TV programs. All of those are appropriate. But let's keep in mind that we don't have personal contact. So are you, am I, taking advantage of that? Are we, in fact, making contact? Are we rubbing shoulders with the world? Are we members of organizations, healthy organizations? Are we volunteering? Boy Scouts, PTA, community organizations? Uh, are we getting out so that we, in fact, are doing that? Because keep in mind that in Jesus' final prayer in John 17, verses 11, 15, and 18 says, I will remain in the world no longer, but they are still in the world, and I am coming to you. Jesus is praying to his Father. And he says, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. Now, we're to remain unpolluted from the world, but in fact, we're to be part of the world, which leads us then to the next thing that we need to really look at for ourselves is, are we building relationships? You know, who do you know? Who do I know? And certainly I can speak for me and my wife as we've gotten older, as our health is more limited in a lot of ways. We don't meet nearly as many people because we aren't nearly as engaged in activities outside of the circle of people that we know. But where we do have opportunity, we should look to build relationships and to recognize that the message of the gospel is communicated not only in words, but in what we do. So to take advantage and opportunities. And then we need to make ourselves available, right? To do good when there is good that can be done. And in doing that, then we need to be sure to point others to Jesus. Paul pointed out, or Peter pointed out, that we have to be ready, right? Be ready to be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks us to give the reason for the hope that's in us. So in our difficulties, especially, why are you still hopeful? Do you enjoy pain? Nope, don't enjoy pain. Do you enjoy poverty? Nope, don't enjoy poverty. Do you enjoy discrimination? Nope, don't enjoy discrimination. The reason I'm hopeful is because I'm confident in who God is. I can endure the things that I can endure, even though they are physically difficult and maybe even emotionally difficult. Not because of who I am, but because of who God is. So we have to point people to Jesus. And the real challenge for us is to remember that the task that Jesus left for us is we can still worship him when we get to heaven. We can still serve him when we get to heaven. We can still fellowship with each other when we get to heaven. But the one thing we cannot do in heaven is to help another person discover how to get to heaven. So when the miserly guy, the rich fool, died and was in torment, he asked, if I can't get some water to at least quench my thirst, can somebody go back and tell my brothers, don't come here? Well, in fact, nobody can go back. So we have to do what we can do while we can do it to help others get where we're seeking to go. To do that, Jesus said to his disciples, you got to be salt. You are the salt. Keep in mind, you are the salt. And you are the light. And to be salt and light means to have impact and strive to have positive difference, not only in the church, but in the world.